the 47 to 49 Civil War, the 48 War of Independence. Do you think that the goal of Ben-Gurion and all the Israelis there that created the state of Israel, do you think the goal was always to expel all of the Arabs? Do you think that was from day one, they were like, this is never going to work with any Arabs in this country. We need to get rid of all of them. And the War of Independence was just a really good reason to do it? Or do you think that was more just a response to all of the surrounding Arab states deciding to go to war with Israel when they declared independence? Curious.
Okay, the Arab narrative about that, on that point, since 1948, has been that the Zionist movement, led by Ben-Gurion at the time, always intended to expel the Arabs. And what happened in 48 followed from their ideology and their intentions and policy. That's the Arab narrative.
Yeah.
My research in the 1980s, and I wrote the book about it, The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem, based on American, Israeli, English, United Nations documentation, etc., showed that there wasn't this intention. This wasn't the intention of the Zionist movement when it entered the war. There had been thinking, and this is a caveat, there had been thinking in the years before, during the 30s and 40s, there had been some thinking by Zionist leaders about the possibility or even the need of transferring, or you could say expelling, some Arabs or all Arabs from the area of the Jewish state to be, before the state came into existence, before the War of 48 broke out. But this was always in the realm of thinking, imagination, what we would like to happen, but never translated into policy or ideology or party platforms. So it was sort of in the air, the idea that, well, the Arabs don't really want us here. They won't be loyal citizens if they live in the area which becomes the Jewish state. They won't be loyal to the Jewish state. They would try and subvert the Jewish state or destroy it. So perhaps it's better, and also we need more room, more land, more space for incoming Jewish immigrants. Jews were being persecuted. The Holocaust was about to happen. So this was the thinking, incidentally, also by the British officials who controlled Palestine. They sent a commission of investigation, the
Peel Commission?
Yeah. The Peel Commission in 36 and 37, it came out with its report, How to Solve the Palestine Problem. And they said the two peoples must be separated. You have to have a Jewish state and an Arab state next to it. In other words, partition. But the Arabs should be moved, transferred from the Jewish state out to the Arab state. Otherwise, they will subvert the Jewish state. There won't be any stability in this arrangement unless there is a movement of population. So the Zionist leaders who heard this said, yes, this makes sense, which it did make sense, demographic sense, security sense, and so on. But it never turned into Israeli policy, that is Zionist, pre-Israel policy. It never became policy, and the Zionist establishment which entered the war at the end of 1947, that is, the Arabs began the war, the Arabs of Palestine attacked the Jews after rejecting the United Nations General Assembly plan. They didn't enter the war with a mindset of expelling the Arabs. We know that because during the first months of the war, December 47, January, February, March 48, they were still thinking in terms of planning the future Jewish state with an Arab minority, a large Arab minority in place. There was no talk about transfer or expulsion. Starting in April 48, they began to think about transfer and actually expel Arabs. That is, this is 4 months after the Arabs began to attack the Zionist enterprise. 4 months into the Civil War.
When you bring up, real quick on that, because you bring up, no, don't apologize. No, I'm just questions as you say this. So you bring up April in 48. A lot of the people that talk about al-Nakba, so the dumb thing they'll say is the Jewish people basically destroyed all the Arab villages and kicked them out. And then obviously a slightly more advanced take on that as well. They didn't actually destroy all of them. I think they forcibly expelled, it might have been 100,000, and then the other 600,000 just left in response to violence. When you look at, because April, I think, was the Deir Yassin massacre, when you look at that event and then you look at the Arabs fleeing the villages, do you think they had good reason to run? Or do you think the idea that Jews were going to just destroy, or Israelis, I don't like to say Jews, I guess, Israelis were going to destroy all of their villages, do you think that was unfounded? Or, yeah, what do you think about when people talk about that 700,000 number of Arabs that fled? Did they need to, or were they looking at actual potential violence from the newly created Israeli state?
Well, I'll tell you, most people, when they get caught up in war, that is, the war reaches their doorstep, shells are beginning to fly over their heads, infantry units are about to assault their village, they do begin to run. This is what happens to people in war. Millions of people fled Paris in 1940 as the German army advanced on Paris. This is how people behave when they are about to be threatened by the tread of tanks and the shelling and whatever happens in wartime when you're caught up in it.
Okay.
But I would put it a bit stronger than that. There were, as you say, you mentioned, there was the Deir Yassin massacre. There were other massacres which are often not talked about, but there were other places where there was violence against Arab inhabitants. There was also Arab massacres of Jews, but the Jews had nowhere to flee to, and they didn't flee, and they were more steadfast. The Arabs had somewhere to flee to. They could flee from the coastal plain to the West Bank, what's called the West Bank, or from the coastal plain to the Gaza Strip, the area which is today engulfed in war, or they could flee to Jordan or Syria. They had somewhere to go to, in the hope, of course, that they would be coming back. Nobody thought they were going forever into exile. They thought they were leaving their homes, which were embattled, and they would come back when the Arabs won, or the United Nations would bring them back, etc. But there were Jewish atrocities, and the Arabs broadcast these after Deir Yassin, exaggerated what happened there and so on, and this certainly subverted the staying power and the confidence of the Arabs in other villages who said, well, if this is what the Jews do when they conquer your village, let's get out of here. So the atrocity factor was important here.
Gotcha.
And there were expulsions in the course of the war. If we're talking about the whole war, that is the civil war part between the two communities in Palestine, the Jews and the Arabs of Palestine, which was followed by the Arab States Army's invasion of Palestine, which is the conventional half of the war. There were expulsions of certain populations, certain inhabitants in certain towns and villages during the war. I wouldn't say that they accounted for more than 10, 15% of the 700,000 who ultimately became refugees. I would add to that probably a similar proportion of Arabs left their homes on advice or orders from Arab commanders or local Arab dignitaries or officials who said, well, let's get out of harm's way, or send your women and children out of harm's way because they're going to be hurt and they'll come back later. But most, like 70%, 80%, probably left simply because they were afraid of being caught up in a war.
Okay, that's fair.
This, I think, is sort of what the conclusion I reached in my research.
Yeah. I think a theme that's going to come up a lot, and I don't know how you feel about this, I'm still going to move by timeline, but there's like a macro feeling that I've had, is I've heard a lot of claims about basically Zionist, territorial, expansionist ideology, that the Zionists have always tried to grab more territory. They did it in 67, they did it in 73, they did it in 48. That's always been the goal from the start. But the big problem that I have when I'm researching this is there's never a period of time where it doesn't seem like the surrounding Arab states do just the right thing to precipitate it and then make the expansion understandable. So like, for instance, if in 67, and I'm going to ask you a question about this later on because there's a huge disagreement over, like, did Israel have a real reason to feel threatened in 67, or were they just being, conquestors? It's hard to buy that when you see so many of Nasser's statements about what he was saying about Israel to the Arab League and everything else afterward, or the trade unionists and everything else. And then it feels like for the Nakba and everything else, it always feels similar. Like, I wish that the people around them would have just chilled, around Israel would have chilled, and then you could see how they would act, and then we can make more concrete claims of like, well, this was like an expansionist process. This was like a country just trying to grab more and more territory. after immediately following the Nakba in 48, and then the War of Independence, the first Arab-Israel War. This is going to be a question I have about like Palestinian identity, like in terms of who are a group of people that feel like they're Palestinians. Some people claim that, in the 1500s and 1600s, when you had Syria, Palestina, this was a cohesive group of people and blah, blah, blah. I've done my own reading and I've come to my own opinions on this. I'm curious for your opinions on it. When do you feel like Palestinians